Thank you very much, Brendan. Of course, in the House of Commons, I sit quite close to Douglas. Some days I'm on the bench in front of him, so I hear Douglas's commentary on most of the other debates as it goes along, and it's colourful and interesting and often fair. Often fair, I would have to say, and I'm delighted to see Douglas here. Of course, also in the House of Commons, a woman who occupies a very, very important position in the House of Commons is a daughter of Glenda's as well. Nolene Delaney runs the members' tea room. It was named as the holiest of holies in a BBC documentary recently, or a documentary series about the House of Commons, and she was very annoyed because Michael Cockrell of the BBC named the person who ran it as being a West Indian woman who was going around with a trolley singing Amazing Grace. And Nolene, her maiden name, she's Nolene Delaney, her maiden name was McDevitt, and she was into the school here, the class of '68 there for the opening of the school, and she's deeply perturbed that people in Donegal will think that she was lying when she said she runs the tea room. She does run the members' tea room. So I said I would make that very clear on her behalf before she returns for some holidays here in a few weeks' time. In terms of the topic we have before us, first of all, when we go back to things like the Good Friday Agreement, let us remember that whole negotiating process, the whole peace process, going back to the Anglo-Irish Agreement and then all the possibilities that stemmed from the context that created, all really derived in many ways from the new experience of wider British-Irish relations within the context of EU membership. And years and years ago, John Hume said, and I think McGill Summer School was one of the places in which he said it was that the common experience, the different experience in the EU would create a different psychological backdrop against which the different competing nationalisms that were contesting politics in the North would be able to adjust themselves and adjust mutually as well. And that is largely what happened. And of course, it was no accident that when we were negotiating institutions and negotiating some methods that would apply within those institutions, that the inspiration of the European experience crept in there as well. And it's not just with things like using de Hond and things like that for allocating systems or whatever, but some of the idea of the institutional models and the idea then of working on a cross-border basis in areas of common interest and building up a different agenda focusing on those interests. So that was part of it. And of course, whenever we set up the cross-border bodies on the back of the Good Friday Agreement, it's no accident then that one of them was specifically the EU programmes body. And of course, it was also the case that in the other areas in which we put forward ideas for cross-border bodies, not all of them agreed. Of course, again, we were borrowing from the experience of some European programmes. And it's also the case that in some of the areas of cooperation under the agreement that aren't necessarily down to the individual implementation bodies, again, some of those were able to go forward based on the framework of European programmes, because in many ways that met the unionist sensitivity around, well, we'll agree to North-South, but not for its own sake, none of this North-Southery or anything like that, nothing contrived. It has to be something that's of mutual benefit and relevant. And so whenever you're able to point to things as fitting clearly within a European model and attracting European funding and fitting in to wider frameworks, then the hang-ups were mitigated and could be wrested, and we could get on with the business. So let's not underestimate the degree to which the context and experience and example of Europe has actually been a conditioning factor at times within our own process and has been quite helpful to have at hand. It is important, if we are going to face a referendum campaign, that people on either side of that campaign shouldn't get into wild exaggeration or any of our own versions of Project Fear. And so, of course, I passionately would want all of Ireland to remain within the EU, and therefore I want the North to be part of voting to remain within the EU in any UK referendum as well. But what we cannot do is start to exaggerate what some of the implications or complications might be. But we shouldn't understate them either, and we shouldn't allow people to be complacent or naive about some of the complications that would arise. Of course, driving here this morning from Derry, of course, there isn't a visible border anymore. That didn't used to be the case. You had a very visible customs border, you had a very, very visible security border, etc. We don't have any of that, and that's to the good for economic and social life in this wider cross-border region. It doesn't mean we don't have borderism in many ways, and in my constituency office recently I had people from the wedding car business in Derry who are essentially being told they're not allowed to turn up at wedding fairs in Donegal because of particular ways in which things are done and the crazy rules that are being implemented and administered there or whatever. So borderism is still there, and it can work both ways, and people were looking for it to work both ways if this is happening. So I'm not pretending that the border isn't there in aspects of economic and administrative life. But part of the purpose of what we committed ourselves to in the agreement was making sure that we would work to enhance cross-border mobility and practicality as much as possible. And of course, many people are cross-border livers and workers every day of the week. The fact is, if we did have an exit of the UK from the EU, those remaining problems of borderism that are there would start to increase. They would be more difficult to deal with and address and ameliorate. And we wouldn't have the same currency of accommodation and cooperation that can apply within some of the North-South arrangements as we do have as well. And of course, those North-South arrangements aren't purely North-South when we consider that some of what we're doing on Interreg involves Scotland as well as regions on both sides of the border here. It's important to remember that sometimes some of the best working examples we have of people working in partnership here politically even stemmed from before the agreement, when it was again people from different political parties on both sides of the border working through the peace programme and building up those partnership experiences that help to condition them forward. And of course we have the cross-border council groups working very well in actually delivering and channelling EU funding and helping to invite good bids and pick good projects and champion good causes and good ideas there, and they're best placed to do so. That whole positive experience of councils on either side of the border working together in their cross-border council groups on a complete cross-party basis, where unionists are very, very comfortable and not at all self-conscious about getting in very much on the ground floor of positive cross-border activity, that would have no ambit. That would all be lost if we found ourselves then in the north outside of the EU. The point has already been made, it was touched on earlier in terms of agriculture. Of course, there would be serious implications for agriculture in the north if it found itself essentially outside of the EU and the CAP frameworks, etc. I know some people are saying, well, and I've heard some unionist politicians say, well, we could go out of the EU and then all the money saved in the European budget could be given to the Northern Ireland farmers instead of the CAP payments. Well, I don't think it's quite going to work like that or in those terms, and just the difficulties and the strains that are going to be caused would have its own difficulties, and also in terms of our agri-food business, not just purely on the farming end of things. Agri-food business would of course be hit in terms of its markets, but it's not only those businesses. As the MP for Derry, I have found myself, yes, confronted with some of the nonsense of European regulation as it affects businesses. And you say, how do people in Brussels come up with these things? How could committees do these things? And so you find yourself, yes, on behalf of businesses in your locality trying to challenge that. But you also know that it's the membership of the EU is what has brought some of those businesses to the locality. So when I'm dealing with a firm like Invista, which is the only lycra spinning plant in the whole of the EU, and they see a challenge because of pending European regulations that would mean that they will not win the internal investment in their company whenever that plant has to be renewed and for the next generation of lycra spinning. They would not win it because EU regulations would mean they would be in jeopardy. They couldn't guarantee to their company that they would be able to use all the processes that they would want to use. So that risks future investment. But they're also quite clear that it's the fact that they're inside the EU is what gives them the best chance of winning that future investment within their own company, so long as they're free of that regulatory difficulty. So there you have the issue summed up. You need to avoid the regulation, but at the same time you need to avoid exit from the EU as well. And that's the careful balance that we need to be bringing in to this debate, and that's where we need to be very clear about what the priorities and purposes are in the debate. And while we can be passionate about those, we shouldn't caricature the positions of others in any way. In terms of the campaign, potential campaign in the north, the book, of course, that the Institute has done has many brilliant essays and brings out a lot of the issues and the observations in this. If we take it that the campaign is about between the four moods, the fully ins, the half ins, the half outs and the fully outs, well then it's clear that in the north, as well as the UK more widely, the big contest is going to be about making sure that the half outs vote along with the half ins for those of us who are in the yes campaign, whereas those who are in the fully outs want to make sure that the half outs vote with them and try to create doubts with the half ins as well. So in terms of the party positions in the north, traditionally the only sort of fully ins would have been the SDLP and I suppose the Alliance Party. The rest tended to be fully outs. They have moved over time and with experience of our institutions and working in the context of Europe and European programmes, I suppose more towards being half outs. The issue will be in any campaign, of course, what the campaign is going to be fought on. And this is where I agree with a large part of what Douglas was saying earlier about the context in which this campaign will be fought. Because if it is seen as being a vote on David Cameron's package or whatever, then people won't be very sure what that is and mightn't be very convinced. The SDLP did a meeting in London recently in the House of Commons in one of the committee rooms, and I was making the point that David Cameron, it's a bit like what used to be said about Christopher Columbus. When he set out, he didn't know where he was going. When he got there, he didn't know where he was, and when he came back, he didn't know where he'd been. And there is potentially that position with David Cameron. It isn't quite clear what exactly it is. Yes, there's to be treaty change. No, well, it doesn't now necessarily have to be treaty change. Well, yes, it has to be substantive on these issues and it has to be repatriation of powers. Well, no, there doesn't necessarily have to be repatriation of powers, just so long as there's clear breaks on certain things. And it starts to get very confused. And when somebody is presenting something in that way, they will not convince fully people within their own party and certainly aren't going to be in a strong position to convince people in other parties, which starts to put its own strain in terms of the basis of a referendum campaign. But the doubts won't just be there. There clearly is fluidity in British politics at the minute, and that will create an uncertain backdrop when it comes then to the parties in the north making their choices about where exactly they are, because people will be fighting the election in the north, partly tuning in, or fighting the referendum, any referendum in the north, partly tuning into what the wider case is and what the wider argument is. It won't be an entirely separate local debate in that sense. And so we have on the left, probably some of the trade unions are going to move probably towards more of a no position, or certainly not a very active yes position. And some of that could well be because in the absence of having anything in which he can say shows he has one treaty change, that he has done something substantive that clearly is a different UK membership of the EU, both for now and for eternity, David Cameron will end up basically trying to rely on, well, if you vote for this, it's going to be part of a whole new trading bloc exercise, a bit like the same terms in which membership was sold in the first place in the 70s. Only this time we will be doing it on the basis of, well, if we stay in the EU, we will get the benefits of TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. But that is an increasingly sensitive issue for many people on the left and for trade unions in particular, not least because of its implications for public services and concerns about the integrity of the health service. So just as we know from the experience of referendums in Ireland, particular issues can suddenly bounce up in a referendum campaign and take on a life of their own and completely against anybody's prediction become the hot issue in an election and can mobilise people. I think we could actually see something like TTIP ending up being a big complicating factor in terms of how people interpret this. And so when it comes to the British Labour Party's position and their ability to bring people with them, and we've seen this week even just the disarray that they have got themselves into with being unable, with abstaining on two key bits of legislation or whatever, and leaving it to the Scottish National Party to basically pose as the sole opposition essentially in Westminster. You can see that there will be difficulties there around the campaign. So I can see why Douglas is actually saying, well, 9% behind in the polls with all of the other things that are in play at the minute isn't a gaping margin, and that's why those of us who would want a yes outcome need to avoid any complacency, but also we need to make sure that in avoiding complacency we don't turn to panic that then brings us into exaggeration and fear-mongering either. People need to have confidence on the basis on which they are being given to come forward. People won't take the scares, nor will they take plumose assurances from what they think are, the wise worthies. Because they will say a lot of these wise worthies that are saying, "Oh, we stay in the EU and it's good for us and it doesn't matter about the detail." These are the same people that told us that things were grand and then we got into a crash. These were the same people that told us that globalisation was okay and we had the right level of regulation of the banks and all the rest of it. That they knew that this was good, this was the way to go. So we need to recognise that there is going to be a serious credibility gap in this campaign for those of us who would be canvassing for a yes as well, and I am realistic about that, and we also have to be responsible and responsive. But we also need to remember that politics in the wider UK is going to be very different no matter what happens in this referendum. The very fact of a referendum being held on this issue is going to make things different. None of the main parties in Britain is going to be in a strong, united, solid position through the referendum campaign. That's going to add to the fluidity that is already there in politics. And we've seen with the Scottish referendum that just the fact of a referendum itself, the political churn that it can create change that feeds through elsewhere into electoral and political life as well, and that's what's going to happen there. So just as Scottish politics and indeed UK politics in general has changed, I mean, the House of Commons is very different now. The physics is the same, but the chemistry is completely different with the scale of the SNP, and that's not the end of the outworking of the Scottish referendum. Similarly, in any EU referendum in UK terms, if it's a yes vote win around change that wasn't very convincing or clear, that will not settle the issue. And there are many people who did move towards saying, well, let's have a referendum to at least settle this issue, because it is a constant issue within UK politics. It's causing difficulties within parties, between parties, etc. Let's have a referendum to settle it. Few people now actually believe that the referendum is actually going to settle it in those terms. So that is a difficulty that we have as well. And so for the British-Irish relationship, we need to recognise that our relationship within and around EU and dealing with EU matters as well as other issues, that is going to be a constant moving factor. It is also going to be an ongoing issue then in terms of the North, and it will affect politics within the North to a degree, and it could also then stilt our capacity to take our own institutions forward. I don't think those institutions have developed anything like they should. North-South has been on a stay low, go slow for far too long. There is much more that we need to be doing there. But the prospect of us lifting North-South cooperation and development in the way that was envisaged under the original prospectus of the Good Friday Agreement, if we have a UK exit, is going to be much, much weaker. We need to stay in, and then we need to get back to not just working the EU the way we should be working it, but also working our own Good Friday Agreement the way we should be working it too.